tiny those little minerals are. Who else wants to come up? Okay, in the orange shirt right there, come on up. And then right behind her, did you want to come up too? You can come up next after her, okay? You get ready. What's in there? Why don't you think they're rocks? Why don't you open it up and take a look? They're beans. Who said there might be mysterious things in this? Do you think there's something mysterious about a bean? I think a bean is a little bit mysterious. What would happen if you put one of those beans in a wet cloth? What would happen?
It'll start to sprout roots, and soon it'll grow into a plant.
Roots will come out of it, and then a stem, and leaves will open up. And pretty soon, it'll turn into a plant. And what's going to grow on the plant? More
Beans.
More beans. You take that one little bean that looks kind of like a rock, looks a lot like a rock, and it turns into food for us. That's sort of miraculous if you stop and think about it for a minute. Shall we keep it among the treasures? I think we shall. Okay, and our last person is going to be the girl in the back. What's in there?
Water?
Is water a treasure?
Yes.
Water is a very, very important treasure. Clean water to drink is a very important treasure. And we have Rachel Carson to thank for the protections that we have in our country for clean drinking water, clean air, protecting endangered species, the Environmental Protection Agency. All these things came into being after Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, and people started to become aware of what a treasure clean water can be. Why don't you take that back to your seat? And do you have some little magnifiers that were passed around? I want you to share these things, pass around, and let's have a couple people come up. And here we have a piece of shale. I'm going to pass this out. Who wants to come help me pass some things out? You come help me pass some things out, would you? Pass this out to people. People have been hearing about the Marcellus shale and the dangers of drilling the Marcellus shale to our clean water. That's what shale looks like. What do you see in that shale? Do you see something there besides just a rock? What is that? And here, and this, you remember in our quote from Rachel Carson in the beginning, she said the forests were one of our resources. So the bark from the tree and the pine cone. And pass this out. And while you're looking with these magnifiers, I'd like you to hear what Rachel Carson said about using a magnifying glass. She said, "Some of nature's most exquisite handiwork is on a miniature scale, as anyone knows who has applied a magnifying glass to a snowflake. An investment of a few dollars in a good hand lens or magnifying glass will bring a new world into being. With your child, look at objects you take for granted as commonplace or uninteresting. A sprinkling of sand grains may appear as gleaming jewels of rose or crystal hue, or as glittering jet beads, or as a melange of Lilliputian rocks, spines of sea urchins, and bits of snail shells. Flowers, the early buds of leaf or flower from any tree, or any small creature reveal unexpected beauty when, aided by a lens, we can escape the limitations of the human size scale. So who would like to ask a question? If you have a question, I want you to stand up, and Tracy will come around with a microphone so that you can ask your question into the microphone. So did you have a question? Stand up.
What are shells made of?
What are shells made of? Who makes shells?
The ocean?
And in the ocean live creatures who don't have skeletons. Their outside is made of shells. So the animals make the shells, and they're made very much out of calcium, just like our bones are made out of calcium.
And then they wash up?
After the animal dies, then it doesn't need its shell anymore, and shells can be carried up onto the beach. And that's where we sometimes find them.
What is bark made out of?
Bark is made out of wood. Bark is like the tree's skin. Just like our skin protects our bodies, the bark protects the tree. So that's why you never want to nail something into a tree, because it's like poking a hole in its skin. The bark is something that the tree uses to stay healthy. Some of you might have a little bag out there with a piece of bark in it, and I see somebody smelling that piece of bark right now. What do you think that piece of bark is?
I think it's cinnamon.
It's cinnamon. It's cinnamon. How many people like cinnamon? I like cinnamon too. Did you know that it comes from the bark of a tree? Aren't trees amazing? I have a question I want to ask you. What would you say to someone who shared a treasure with you? What would you say? Shout it out.
Thank you.
And I want to say thank you to the Rachel Carson Literary Estate, which is administered by the Francis Collin Literary Agency. They have given permission for us to share all of these quotations with Rachel Carson that you are hearing tonight. So I want to say thank you to them. I also want to say thank you to a very special person named Linda Lear. Linda Lear wrote a biography of Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson, Witness for Nature. She extensively researched this book and wrote it beautifully. And it is the source of probably 90% of what I know about Rachel Carson. So without Linda Lear and her important work, we wouldn't have all this information about Rachel Carson that we're sharing tonight. A lot of the quotes that we're reading come from this book, Lost Woods, which Linda Lear edited. And if anybody wants to learn more about Rachel Carson after tonight's program, you should go down to your library, and if they don't have it, you should ask them to get it. This is a collection of writings from Rachel Carson. It includes excerpts from her ocean books, from Silent Spring, from a story that she wrote that was published when she was only 14 years old. And with each example of her writing, there's a little bit of information about what was happening in Rachel Carson's life at that time. So thank you to the Rachel Carson Literary Estate, and thank you to Linda Lear. Now, what other questions do you have for me? I think we have a question right over here, Tracy.
What's your question for Vivian?
How many books did Rachel Carson write?
Rachel Carson wrote 4 books. She wrote 3 books about the ocean. And the 3rd book, The Sea Around Us, was so popular that she had a lot of fans, and people started writing to her. And they asked her questions about things that were happening in the world around them, things that frightened them. They saw birds dying and flowers dying. And that was when she decided that she needed to write her fourth book, Silent Spring. Then there's a fifth book, this book, The Sense of Wonder, which she wrote as a magazine article. And she wanted to expand the magazine article and write it as a book. But before that could happen, she died at the age of only 56 of breast cancer. So her publishers decided that they would take the magazine article that she had written for Women's Home Companion in 1954 and illustrate that magazine article with beautiful photographs that showed the world that she was talking about in her article, Teach Your Child to Wonder. So this became the fifth book that Rachel Carson wrote.
Did Rachel Carson have kids?
Rachel Carson never had children of her own. I like to think she had plenty of family without having any of her own. There was one point in time when she was a graduate student and she was also working part-time because she was supporting her mother and her father and her sister's two daughters. And she helped to raise her sister's two daughters. And then later, when one of the nieces died when she was still very young, Rachel adopted her nephew Roger. And it was Roger that she was writing about in The Sense of Wonder, exploring nature with him. So she did have Roger and her sister's children, even though she never married and had children of her own.
Did Rachel Carson family members write any books?
No one else in her family wrote a book that I know of.
And how about you, young lady?
Where do fish come from?
Where do fish come from? Can I give the easy answer? The water. And water, as we all know, is a treasure.
What's your question for Vivian?
My question is, how many, did she ever write about, because I'm doing a science project in school about tropical tundras in the rainforest and the savanna and the desert. Has she ever wrote about any specific locations about tundras? Because I'm doing a PowerPoint and I need
She wrote more about the ocean than she wrote about the land. She loved the ocean. She loved the ocean so much that she applied for and was accepted to a graduate program in marine zoology before she had ever even seen the ocean. She wrote a book called The Edge of the Sea about the very land at the very edge where the water meets the land. And she wrote about preserving areas for wildlife. So there were many things she wrote about that weren't in her books. She wrote when she was the editor-in-chief of all publications for the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. She wrote about conserving land for nature. She wrote magazine articles and newspaper articles. So if you went searching, you might be able to find something that she wrote about the tundra.
So Vivian, I'm here with Jackie Genovese, and Jackie is the Senior Director of Education for the Philadelphia Academy of Natural Science. Jackie, begin by telling us a little bit about the museum and what it does, and then go right ahead with your question for Vivian.
So the Academy is a leader in Philadelphia's cultural and science institutions, and in 2012 we'll be celebrating our bicentennial, entering our third century of educating people about science. And for the Academy, one of our missions is to make people aware of the environment and how we can protect the environment. And so my question for Vivian is, knowing that Rachel Carson was such a proponent of